Top of the morning, Dan and Amy. Nearing the end of his life, Francis Cardinal George said, and I'm quoting, "I expect to die in my bed. My successor will die in prison, and his successor will die a martyr in the public square, and his successor will pick up the shards of a ruined society and slowly help rebuild civilization, as the church has done so often in human history." I expect to die in my bed, which he did. My successor will die in prison, his successor a martyr in the public square. 71-year-old Christian pastor and grandfather arrested in London on the charge of making homophobic comments for preaching what the Bible says about marriage. John Sherwood, a pastor of 35 years at an independent evangelical church in North London, was preaching Genesis 1 outside of the tube station in Oxbridge, in West London. And there were complaints, and he got arrested under the Public Order Act in the UK. Now, again, they don't have a First Amendment, but still. The Public Act, which stipulates that action be taken if one's abusive or insulting words do harm to someone else. Word crimes. And then thought crimes follows. And by the way, we have those sorts of word crimes and thought crimes in this country. They're not codified into law because they wouldn't hold up to constitutional scrutiny right now. They would on a college campus. Sherwood told the police, the pastor, "I was exercising my religious liberty and my conscience. I was forcibly pulled down from the steps, suffered some injury to my wrist and to my elbow. I do believe I was treated shamefully. It should have never happened." And listen to this. While in custody, he was grilled by police concerning his opinions on gay people. He was questioned as to what he would do if his own children were gay. That's a police inquiry?
That's a none of your business question.
He insisted, because he's
Right.
skilled here. The question was irrelevant to the allegation against me. I said I would seek to bring them to Christ, but of course I would love them no matter what because they're my children. Right. A colleague of his, a pastor at a Methodist church in Buckinghamshire, pointed out if there was a pride parade in Oxbridge, the police would support it even if Christians were offended, per the Public Act standard of if somebody says something that causes someone else quote-unquote harm, meaning distress, meaning disagreement. I expect to die in my bed, my successor in prison, his successor martyred in the public square, and then maybe we rebuild civilization slowly. For more on the topic, we're pleased to be joined by our friend Rusty Reno, the editor at First Things, firstthings.com. Rusty, thanks for joining us again. Appreciate it.
Oh, great to be with you guys.
What about that story of the pastor in West London and what that tells us about the state of affairs in the West, particularly for people of faith?
Well, Dan, you mentioned that we have a First Amendment, and that's certainly a great protection. But in typical American fashion, we've privatized a lot of censorship. And so, in point of fact, your employment, your social media presence, all those things can be taken away from you if you commit these word crimes, because the Twitter mobs will come after you. So I think it's a problem throughout the West. This is it a velvet totalitarianism? I mean, it's not like people are putting a bullet in the back of people's heads the way they did in the Russian Revolution, or send people to gulags. But it is. Anytime you are questioning, as you say, you get arrested for public disturbance, and next thing you know, it's an inquisition into what your views on homosexuality are. That's pretty totalitarian.
I'd say, and here's how it works here. There's no formal gulag, Solzhenitsyn style, but you are, banished from civil society. Everybody is told to turn on you, separated from your position, separated from your private associations, but you get a $1,400 check in the mail from the government, so it's okay.
Yeah. Well, right. As I tell, velvet totalitarianism. But the silence is violence. That's a totalitarian principle. That's an absolute totalitarian. If you're not publicly affirming and saluting the cause, then you can be targeted for retribution. When that was being said last summer, it just sent chills down my spine.
Me too. Because I had a neighbor question me, like, why aren't you in the rally? And I said, because I choose not to do that with my time. And being silent was violent in their minds. I really didn't care. But how long do you think is this our new normal? I mean, is this how life is going to be for the foreseeable future?
It's hard to say, but I'm of two minds on this. On the one hand, obviously, it's very dangerous and harmful to the people who are in the crosshairs of these kinds of attacks. And the pastor, in London being a good example of that. And we can certainly come up with, James Damore at Google, Brendan Ike, who
Mozilla.
was, so Mozilla, yeah, exactly. And Amy Wax at Penn Law School. People whose careers are damaged, and potentially their livelihoods taken away. But on the other hand, I think it's not a sign of strength. In other words, there's an element of panic and desperation in the progressive left that they're just horrified that, well, wait a minute, I thought we won. I thought history was on our side. How come everybody's not agreeing with us? And so the reality of dissent in our society, I think, causes panic among the progressive left. And that, as I say, is not a sign of strength, but rather of weakness.
But
I don't know how it's going to all play out.
Yeah, I mean, the concern, of course, the lessons of history, when those totalitarianly inclined start to panic, then the repression gets much more oppressive much faster.
Yes, I do think that that's certainly the short-term reality. I think the panic after the mob and the Capitol, this is an insurrection, domestic terrorism, it's an emergency, and I think that this will lead to disastrously bad policies on the part of our security state as they crank down on what they perceive to be threats, which I think they'll way overdo it, and there'll be backlash as a result. But I do agree, short-term panic does lead to bad decisions by the elite who wind up overreaching and over-repressing.
What's your assessment, though? I mean, part of the disappointment in these times, whether it is on sort of the Marxist purge that's going on or the COVID lockdowns and the intersection of the two, is that I haven't been overwhelmed by the response from faith communities, from men of the cloth either, including my own church, the Catholic Church. I have not been overwhelmed by the response. I have been underwhelmed and disappointed by the response of so many who have served as little more than sentinels of the state.
Certainly that was true, although it's changed in the last 3 months or so. It seems as though the churchmen, I also am Catholic, that the churchmen have recognized that they cannot be permanent adjuncts of the public health regime and subordinate the spiritual health of their flock to the public health demands of the moment. So I'm gratified to see that there has been positive change in that regard over the last, around Christmas time, the winter return to lockdown. The church was much better about insisting on accommodation to its sacramental life.
You wrote it,
but yes, I do agree. It was there was, and these things interact. I think we're in an atmosphere where there's constant emergency, climate emergency, terrorism emergency, pandemic emergency, emergency. We had 2008 financial crisis, and now we've got another economic emergency that, or at least a perceived one, that the Biden administration is using to spend trillions and trillions of dollars to achieve their political goals. So I think one thing that I think listeners need to really become very skeptical of emergency talk. Yes, we got problems. Yes, we got challenges, but welcome to life.
Yeah, right.
And resist being stampeded into a panic situation with all this talk about emergencies.
Right, because of course that you're being stampeded into the stable. I mean, this is all the response always is look to government, and so that's the opportunity that's being taken advantage of by those who really see themselves as a vanguard class, the central planners who should be in charge.
Yes, I mean, it's not just government, but here in New York, where I live, the governor of the state is still governing under an emergency decree. Right. So my ability to leave my apartment is contingent upon Governor Cuomo saying it's okay to do it. I mean, it's a sort of insane forfeiting of our civil liberties for what's now more than a year. Maybe back in March we didn't know very much, and it was a scary situation. Maybe it was legitimate for 2 weeks or even 6 weeks, but more than a year, I do agree, Dan. It does reflect the people who think of themselves as our betters feel like, let's not mess around with this democratic process. It's too slow and unwieldy. We should just tell people what to do. We should just make the rules.
I mean, it's so people should never forget how quickly the government took away sporting events, classrooms, restaurants, church pew access, all of that, and they seem content with that. And now I'm upset that it even happened.
And how quickly all those institutions folded in.
Well, but see, I think, Dan, part of it is that those institutions are they're all networked together in sort of an elite class. And I think part of what we saw with the Trump phenomenon in 2016 is that the general public is losing its trust in the established institutions of our society, and because they don't see them as serving their interests. I think there's good reason for that distrust, actually. And I think the last year is evidence that what's good for the laptop class is not necessarily good for the average American.
You wrote a piece back in 2016 that I flagged at the time as one of the most important pieces written that year, along with Shelby Steele's piece on our culture of deference. And it spoke to bigot baiting and solidarity and marginality, which 4 years later that column was even more prescient than I thought it was at the time. We sort of saw some of the seedlings there, but now they quickly grew into mighty oaks, those two pillars of the left. Solidarity and marginality and bigot baiting. Just as a bit of a refresher, explain the left's usage of those tactics.
The Democratic Party has, throughout the 20th century, been the party of people who feel marginalized or excluded by the kind of Main Street, white Protestant dominant class, and it's Catholics and blacks and and so on. And as we succeed as a society in having a more open and inclusive society, that coalition becomes more fragile. We saw that in the last electoral cycle, where we had slight movement of Hispanic and black voters towards Trump. And this terrifies the left, because it means that their source of democratic legitimacy is undermined. So they have to amp up racism. They have to amp up discrimination, charges of discrimination, to keep their constituency afraid and returning again and again to them to protect them from the wicked white supremacists. And so if white supremacy, if racism were to go away, the left would have to reinvent it. So there's a strong incentive they have now politically to make racial relations worse, not better. Because if race relations are good, then people start to vote according to everybody's different. Some people have a certain set of interests and ideals that will lead them to vote in Democrat. Some will be Republican, which is not what the left wants. It wants to keep these pillars of support strong, and to do that, they have to hammer away at how bad American society is and how discriminatory it is and systemic racism, et cetera, et cetera. So this is, as you said, Dan, this is amped up now 4 or 5 years after I wrote that piece, and I fear it's only going to get worse. My only hope is that ordinary Americans start to shake their head and say, well, wait a minute, this does not correspond to my experience. And I see some evidence of that. Like I said, this last electoral cycle, you read the New York Times, you would think that our country, was about to be taken over by the Ku Klux Klan. But, as I say, the voting shook out in a trend line that would suggest a breakdown of racialized voting rather than an intensification of it. I see that as a very encouraging sign for our country.
All right, well, let's end on an encouraging sign. Rusty Reno, editor at First Things, firstthings.com. Check it out if you haven't. Rusty, thanks as always. Appreciate it.
Great to be with you guys. Okay, have a great day.
Thanks, you too. And he joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.
Listen to podcast of Dan